On this episode of Most Notorious, Sophie Lyons, nicknamed Queen of the Burglars, and one of the late 19th century's most prolific American thieves and con artists.
She started getting the man alone in a hotel room and then stealing his clothes and either throwing them out the window or throwing them in a trunk and locking them in a trunk, and then forcing the man to write her a check or give her cash, usually it was a check, to get the clothing back so he could leave.
Welcome everyone to another episode. I'm Eric Rivenes. As always, I am so glad you're here. Okay, well, on to the show. So great to have as my guest today, Shayne Davidson. She has more than 30 years of experience as a genealogist, illustrator, and author. And the book she is here to chat about today is called Queen of the Burglars, The Scandalous Life of Sophie Lyons. Great to have you here. Thank you.
Great to be here, Eric. Thank you.
Yes. So Sophie Lyons was a woman with an incredibly colorful life, but I don't recall coming across her name before picking up your book. How did you first discover her, and how did your discovery turn into a book?
Well, actually, I believe I first discovered her by looking at a book called Professional Criminals of America, which was published in 1886 by a man named Thomas Burns, who was the chief of detectives of the New York City Police. And he was quite a well-known policeman of the 19th century, probably the best-known American policeman of that era. And he published this book in 1886 called Professional Criminals of America, and it's a very fascinating book. It contains 204 mugshots of the people that Mr. Burns thought were the most villainous and evil and serious criminals at that time. And he also included sort of short criminal biographies of these people. And so I was looking through, the book was actually republished in 1969. And I was looking, so I had that copy and I was looking through it. And he doesn't include very many women in the book, but he included 18 out of his 204. So I was looking through those women's photos, and I was really struck by the fact that there was only one woman who looked different than the other women. She looked relaxed, almost pleased that somebody was photographing her in a police context. She's kind of smiling. And most of the people in the book are kind of looking away, or they're looking down, or they're frowning, or they're looking unhappy, as you would expect. But she was looking different. And so I read the little bio that he included about her, and it talked about her history. And when I get interested in a person, and I'm very interested in crime history, so we're primarily talking about crime here. When I get interested in a person, I create a
family tree for them.
That's just something I do to relax, I guess. It's a hobby. I enjoy doing it. So I started a family tree for her, figuring, and when you're trying to trace criminals in the context of genealogy, it's quite difficult. And I think that's one of the things I really like about it. It's a big challenge because for the most part, they didn't want to be found. And they would avoid, census takers or whoever. And so I started a family tree for Sophie. And I just kind of worked on it occasionally, here and there, whenever I had a little time. And it was interesting to me. And I began looking for an original copy of this Burns book, this Professional Criminals of America, an 1886 copy, because I decided I wanted to own it. And in addition, another odd hobby that I have is that I collect mugshots, early mugshots, primarily 19th century mugshots, but I go into the 20th a little bit. But I was interested in having an original copy of the book, and as you might expect, it's expensive. So there aren't very many of them.
I'll bet.
But I noticed that a copy came up at a rare book shop in Detroit, which is near where I live. So I checked it out. I was looking at it online, and there were a number of photos from the book were put online by the bookseller, and I noticed that on one page it said the book. It had a name written in the book. The name was Florence L. Bauer, and I thought, I've just been making this family tree for Sophie Lyons, and I think this Florence L. Bauer was her daughter, because Florence, her married name was Bauer. So I thought this could be, Sophie Lyons' daughter's book, and it could even be Sophie's book. So I thought, I'm real interested. I'm going to have to go look at this book. So I did. I went there and looked at it, and it looked totally like, it was legitimately, somebody had just written this name in there, and it was probably the person who owned it. So I bought the book, and that sort of got me started with thinking about Sophie and maybe doing more about her life. And I had been looking for a biography of her. I assumed that there would be one, but there wasn't. And I was sort of frustrated by that. I really didn't intend to write a book, but I really wanted to read a book about her life. So ultimately, I decided, well, I guess I'm going to have to write the book since nobody else has written the book.
Absolutely, yeah.
So anyway, that's how it started.
Right.
Yeah.
So Sophie was a professional liar with dozens of aliases.
Right.
It must have been an incredible challenge to research this book, not knowing what to believe.
Right.
And tracking a woman whose sole purpose in life was to cheat and to avoid detection.
Yes. It was hard. And I think that pre the digital era, it would have been pretty much impossible to do. I mean, I think it would have taken years and years and years. But now we have so many things available online, digitally, records, genealogical records, Google Books, photographs. There's just such rich source material. That made it quite a bit easier. And, using my family tree as a sort of skeleton for the biography, I knew I had a sense of what was basically accurate and what wasn't, based on, having those records available to me. And then, I did a lot of newspaper research, and I pretty much just went with whatever was the thing, the newspaper article that came out closest to the time of the event, or or a newspaper article that I could verify in other ways. Some other way, like maybe somebody was mentioned, and I could discover whether or not that person really existed and whether the information about them matched what I was being told in the article. So that's how it went.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And then I also strangely, well, a few other kind of strange things happened as I was starting with the idea of writing the book, which was I realized I came across a Google Books discussion of one of her pickpocketing events, and I found that it had happened only about 4 blocks from my house. So I was really shocked at that. And I also discovered this photograph online of one of her daughters. I can't even remember. I discovered it on eBay and I bought it, and I can't even remember anymore why I was looking. I guess I was searching for her children or something, photos, which would have been a waste of time. But amazingly, I did find this one beautiful photo of her daughter, who was an opera singer. So those were just sort of strange coincidences that sort of kept me going.
Right, yeah. So if you don't mind, let's start at the beginning. Sophie came to America as an immigrant, among millions of immigrants,
Right.
the vast majority of whom became law-abiding, productive citizens.
Yes, absolutely.
But that wasn't the case for her, was it?
No, it wasn't. But, to be fair, her parents were criminals and they forced her into being a criminal. They taught her how to be a criminal when she was a child. So we can't really blame her for that. That was, that was the path that they wanted her to take. And according to her, and she wrote a memoir, by the way, in 1913. And according to her memoir, they forced her with physical violence to carry out these pickpocketing and shoplifting expeditions.
Can you give us a timeline of her early life? This was the 1860s, right?
Correct, yes. She was born December 24th, 1847 in Lauben, Germany. And she came to America in 1855. Interestingly, her mom and dad and an infant daughter came the year before. So they went separately. Then she came with her, a couple of siblings died in Germany, but she came with her two brothers and then two older cousins who apparently sort of shepherded the younger children, including Sophie, to America. And they, arrived in New York, and that's where her father and mother had settled. So that's where, the kids were headed, to New York City. And of course, they lived in the poor section on the Lower East Side. And that's where the criminality, as far as I can tell, that's where it began. So it escalated pretty rapidly to the point where by the time she was 12, she was incarcerated in the House of Refuge in New York City, which was the first juvenile detention facility in America. So she pulled some kind of a burglary that got her sent there. And I'm sure she'd been doing other things. She claimed she'd been arrested many, many times as a young child. But the first real definite arrest that can be verified is that she was at the house of, her incarceration at the House of Refuge.
You mention in your book that one of the only times she felt like a kid was when a police officer picked her up off the street and let her play with some toys and even took her home temporarily.
Yes. Well, he gave her candy. It's not clear that he took her home. He gave her candy, and she was supposedly in the police station, being held. And I mean, I don't know exactly what the story is in terms of the New York City police holding children in a police station. I find it hard to believe that anybody was ever held for very long. Any child was held for very long. But she claimed they gave her candy and, it was nice. She didn't have to deal with her parents who were always, burning her with hot pokers, and her cousin who was kicking her around. So it's a very sad early life.
She met a guy by the name of John Larney pretty early on, right?
Yes, John Larney. His nickname was Molly Matches, and that's what he was more known by. You can find many pictures of him online. He was apparently sort of a con child, if that's such a thing, who was passing himself off as a girl, to a match girl in New York City, and going around selling matches, but actually he was picking people's pockets while he was doing that. So somehow that nickname, Molly Matches, stuck. But he was a career criminal. He had a very, very long history of primarily just being a pickpocket. So yes, they apparently hung out together. And she also hung out with Adam Worth, who was later known as the Napoleon of Crime. A book has been written about his exploits, which are quite interesting. So yeah, there were a lot of pickpockets and shoplifters and going around in New York City, and she knew a lot of them.
And her first husband, she married pretty young.
Yes.
And his name was Maury Harris.
His name was Maury Harris, yes. And he appears to have been a career criminal also. But the marriage, I mean, she was quite young, possibly happened as early as 1863 when she was maybe only 15. And the marriage doesn't seem to have lasted very long because she had been in the House of Refuge. She came out and she seems to have started to work with Marm Mandelbaum at that point, who was the most well-known fence in really in America in the 19th century. And Marm had a lot of pickpockets who worked for her. And Sophie was one. And I think that that's where Sophie met many of her colleagues in crime. I don't know if Maury was one of her pickpockets, but that's where she met her second husband, Ned Lyons.
If there was ever an American version of Oliver Twist made, Fagin would be Marm Mandelbaum, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes. There's also been a book written about Marm Mandelbaum. So, and there are no photos of her, unfortunately, but there are a couple drawings of her. So that it kind of gives you a sense of what these people were about. She was apparently a rather large woman who never wore a corset, according to George Walling, the chief of police at the time. Of course, he was interested in, being nasty to her, so he didn't like her. So, you always have to listen to who the source is of this material.
Right.
So, yeah.
But Marm was pretty much a mother figure to Sophie, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think so because, Sophie didn't like her mother and, because her mother was forcing her to be a criminal. And by the time she was with Marm was, she was doing her criminality by choice, apparently, with Marm. And Marm a lot of people called her mother, but Sophie definitely called her mother. And she took care of the people who worked for her. That was part of her success, I think, was that she cared about them.
Would you describe for my listeners what Sophie looked like?
Sure. Well, she was short. She had brown hair, gray eyes. She doesn't really look like she was classically beautiful, but she was apparently very alluring. And she knew apparently how to use her features and whatever physical attributes she had. She knew how to use them to her advantage. So a lot of men were interested in her, and she had some sort of sex appeal. And there are many photos of her available across a fairly long time period. So we get a pretty good sense of what she looked like. She was, she had no problem looking you straight in the eye. And she, I don't know what else to say. Although she did also like to cover herself up a lot because that was one of her techniques that she used to keep people from being able to identify her, was to wear hats with heavy veils. So I guess she would decide who would get to see her and who wouldn't. So.
And you also write that she kept her hair cropped, really short.
Well, she did later on, yes. I would say that was not at first. That was probably not until the late 1870s and 1880s. And at that point, she's using a lot of disguises and she is wearing wigs frequently. So I think it just helped her when she's wearing these big veiled hats or she's wearing wigs to not have a lot of hair to deal with. And then later on, when she became middle-aged, she grew her hair again because she wasn't needing those types of disguises.
And we will return in just a moment. Back again. I think for me, the most interesting relationship that she had, and it would be for many years, was with a man named Ned Lyons. Mm-hmm. Would you tell us about him and them together?
Sure. Well, let me say all of her. She had four husbands, and they were all thieves. So, no honest men here. But yeah, Ned was a bank robber. He was quite well known as a bank robber in New York City. By the time the two of them got married, he was an immigrant from Ireland. He lived with his mother uh, for a while in Massachusetts, and he got married there. And he apparently dumped his first wife, moved to New York City, and got involved in the gangs that were doing bank robberies there. And this was where, at a time when bank robbery was big, and the bank robbers were at the top of the heap, and if they were successful. And most of the big banks were in New York City at this time, so that's what the draw was. He was apparently a very willing to fight anybody who crossed him, but he was also apparently very personable. So people liked him. So as long as they stayed on his good side, everything went well. And he was said to dress like a better what was it? A better ward boss. So he apparently was a snappy dresser, but not maybe not real fashionable, but a little tasteless, but snappy.
Right.
And yeah, he loved to do bank robberies, evidently, and he did quite a lot of them. And then in 1869, he and Sophie were married at this point. He did this ocean bank robbery, which was a very big deal. It was the biggest bank robbery that had happened up to that point in New York City. There would be bigger ones that would come later, but that was a big one. And it was done very cleverly. These bank robberies took a lot of planning back then. It wasn't people going in with guns, like Dillinger. It was they were generally the successful ones that yielded large takes were required a lot of planning. So with the Ocean City or the Ocean Bank, they rented the space below the bank. It was like a sort of a garden apartment type of space. If you're familiar with, some of the buildings, the older buildings in New York City, and they rented this building, this garden area, and they set up some partitions so people couldn't see what they were doing. And they started to, on hours when people weren't in the banks, they started to work on getting through the floor, the ceiling of where they were, and that was the floor of the bank. And then on a Sunday, the bank was not guarded, which is amazing. And on a Sunday, they finally broke through, and Ned was the cracksman, so he was the person who would open the safe or the vault or both. So they got through it, and they got away with a very large amount of money. It was said to be either between $500,000 and $1 million of the currency of that time period. So that was a big robbery and a big boost to Ned's notoriety as a criminal.
At some point, he loses his left ear,
Yes.
doesn't he,
Mm-hmm.
in a fight? And that makes it much more difficult for him to blend into a crowd.
Correct, right. So this is, the important thing to understand is that at this time period, when photography is still kind of only occasionally being used, and it's not being used in any consistent way, people relied on, disguises, aliases, things like that, lack of any kind of records to prove who they were. They relied on those things to get away with crime. I mean, in a very big way. People who were professional criminals, this was really a very important aspect to how they would, even if they were arrested, how they would get off. And when he lost most of his ear when he was in a street fight with another criminal named Jimmy Haggerty, and Jimmy bit his ear off. So, this is kind of like Gangs of New York type stuff. It was very bad for him. It made him much more recognizable when he doesn't have that big chunk of his ear. So, yeah.
They end up having quite a few children together, too.
They ended up having 6 children at least. Those were the children that could be traced. It's possible they had more. There may have been miscarriages or stillbirths or whatever, because at some point Sophie claimed she had 10 total. But she was always lying about things, so who knows? But so there were 6 children who could be traced to them, but it's not clear that some of those children were his, because they were definitely on the outs by the 1870s, and she was running around meeting other men. So but definitely the first 3 children were his. I'm convinced of that. After that, I make no promises.
And it was a pretty rough life for the kids, especially when they were both serving prison sentences at the same time. And the kids would just get dumped off at various places.
Oh, it was a terrible life for them. Yeah, it was absolutely terrible. They were being moved around to different, maybe at the home of a friend, or at one point, Sophie put them in the house of refuge on Randall's Island, and in the orphanage, excuse me, not the house of refuge, in the orphanage on Randall's Island, which was in the same general vicinity of where she'd been incarcerated when she was 12. So it was a terrible life for them. And one of the children, the youngest of those first 3, she died. We don't really know exactly what took her, but it was some kind of infectious disease. So, that left just the 2, and they had a rough time.
So one of the many stories I found fascinating was the one where she and Ned both escaped from prison, literally just weeks apart from each other.
Right. Well, that was, they escaped from Sing Sing prison. They both ended up incarcerated in Sing Sing for different crimes, not crimes they had done together. But they ended up at Sing Sing. Now, of course, there was a men's prison and a women's prison. They weren't mixing people together. But Ned was not going to stay in Sing Sing. So he had plenty of money. So, this was going to involve bribery and, some people helping him from the outside. But he managed to get a couple of other criminals to help him escape. But he also needed somebody from the inside. So he found a man who was trusted by the warden, and they began to work together. And he said, "Look, if you help me, you'll be part of this escape. You'll get out too." And the guy said, "Great." So they started to work together, and the man worked in the office of the prison, and he managed to get some documents that they got out of the prison to people working outside. And through the use of these documents, they sent an invitation to the warden and his assistant to go see the funeral of Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley being a very famous newspaper man who died in 1872 in New York City, and was going to have a huge funeral, that was going to go down Fifth Avenue. So they got these documents out, and the warden and his assistant were invited. So that was the crucial thing, to get them out of the way. And then, they could bribe some guards and whatnot, and they got some clothing and beards, fake beards, hats and things into the prison. And the minute the warden and his assistant left, they put this garb on, these disguises on, and met their crooks who were waiting outside with a horse and carriage, and left. They walked out of Sing Sing. And then Ned came back a few weeks later, and he got Sophie out of the women's side. But, there were prison breaks happening back then. I mean, Sophie's third husband, Jim Brady, was escaped from prison. I do not know. I can't remember how many times, like 3 or 4 or 5 times. It was, it happened a fair amount. It's just that this escape from Sing Sing was kind of it was interesting the way they did it. Again, it required some planning, and so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, in the past, I've done some episodes on prolific con artists from the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that they were all able to really take advantage of is the fact that there was no national database of information.
Oh, yeah.
And they could move from state to state with new names easily and have decently long and relatively nonviolent criminal careers if they played it carefully.
Right. Absolutely. That was very huge. That was very important. And that's why when Thomas Burns came out with his book, Professional Criminals of America, things got quite a bit tighter, particularly in New York City for people, because now there were faces that could be put with names and people's sort of MO. So I think it's at that point that a number of these people decided that New York was just not a good place to be any longer, and they got out. And Sophie, her photo in the book was taken in 1886 in New York when she happened to go back there, and she did some shoplifting, and she got caught. And I think she had no idea that I'm sure she had no idea that Burns was busy working or had the idea for this book. And that photo ended up in the book. And then newspapers from there on out would do drawings based on that photo. And, they're not often very good drawings, but they're good enough that she could be recognized. So I'm not sure she would have been smiling had she known that this was what was going to happen with her photo.
Right. This book would haunt her for a while.
For quite a while, yes.
Make her life difficult. But you mentioned the book you have, her daughter's copy.
Mm-hmm.
There was probably some part of Sophie that was pleased that she made it into that book, a book that documented the top criminals in the country. There must have been some iota of satisfaction for a job well done, I guess.
I'm sure there was, because the book, the binding of the book is broken in that, on the pages where she appears. So those pages were clearly looked at a lot. So yes, I think so. I think you're right.
So one of the things she became an expert at, you write, is what you call the classic blackmail swindle,
Mm-hmm.
the Badger game. What was the Badger game?
Well, the Badger game normally was where a woman who was, I don't know if you want to say prostitute, but a woman who was willing to have sex with men would lure a wealthy man, convince so it's sort of part con game, part sex work. She would lure a wealthy man into believing that she was a, above board woman, a regular woman, not a sex worker, and she would get him to come with her to her home, and then claim, oh, let's get into bed, and he would usually get pulled into the idea and start undressing, and then her husband or brother or father or whoever would suddenly show up. And oh goodness, oh dear, my husband is home. You've got to get out of here quickly. And the husband would storm into the room and demand money from the man. And of course, the man didn't want to be, because he's got some kind of reputation in the community. He didn't want to be outed as being involved in this kind of activity. So he would pay up. So that's how the Badger game worked. I mean, there were variations on it, but that's the basic scheme. So Sophie started doing that, but she started doing it in a different way. She started getting the man alone in a hotel room and then stealing his clothes and either throwing them out the window or throwing them in a trunk and locking them in a trunk, and then forcing the man to write her a check or give her cash, usually it was a check, to get the clothing back so he could leave. So she was pulling these cons by herself. And she was netting a lot of money doing this, and she didn't have to share it with anybody. So it was quite bold. It involved her ability as an actress and to pass herself off as a nice woman, a society woman, perhaps even. Because she would go to a city where she wasn't known. She would scope out who the well-off men were, and she would somehow figure out, oh, this guy might, be a good mark for me. And she would go and say, hey, I'm new in town and I want to do this real estate transaction, or I want to buy some land or something. And so she would come up with very believable ways to get the man to, get him into her net. And then she'd say, oh dear, I left the deed in my hotel room. Would you mind meeting me there? Something like that. So, yeah, I mean, this was the con woman side of her, but it also was the actress side and the side that liked to dress up and trick people into thinking she was somebody she wasn't. And of course, she'd been trained to do that from an early age by her mother, who had taken her to various places in New York City where her mother would dress her up, and this was the way that they could go to Barnum's American Museum, and nobody would say, oh, there's a poor girl from the Lower East Side. They'd say, oh, this is a nice girl. I don't have to worry about her. And meanwhile, she's slitting their pockets with a knife and reaching in and removing their cash. So,
Yeah, that reminds me. She liked to work fairs too.
she loved to work fairs as a pickpocket. Yes, those all pickpockets were drawn to places like that because there were lots of people crowded together and people were distracted, and people weren't paying attention to what they were doing with their, what was happening with their money, and or their watch or whatever. So yes, she did much of that. Yes. When she was arrested in Ann Arbor, not far from my house, she was at the Washtenaw County Fair, and which was a big event. It was one of these fairs where farmers would come and show their wares and things like that. And she was in the floral hall, and she found a mark, and it was an elderly woman. She said, she went up to the woman and said, "Oh dear, I think you've dropped your watch, your handkerchief." And she said, "Let me get it for you." So she picked up the woman's handkerchief, and in the meantime, she robbed her. While she was close enough to her to do that, she robbed her of her watch and chain. So you do that many times a day, and and watches were a big deal back then. They were valuable. So yeah, you've made a pretty good take. So
Yeah, and I think she was eventually caught on that one, right? She took it to a pawn shop or something.
right. Well, she didn't take it to a pawn shop, but she was working with a fence in Detroit who took it to a pawn shop. And yes, they at that point the Detroit police was so sick of dealing with her. They were really looking for some way to just get her, off their out of their area and out of their hair. So yeah, they really worked hard on that particular um, conviction. They had to try her 3 times for stealing one watch and chain, and eventually she was incarcerated in the House of Correction in Detroit, but twice. But eventually, she was found not guilty in the third trial, and she got off. Who knows how much money they must have spent. So.
Have you ever added up the number of times she'd been arrested or tried, convicted, gone to prison?
No, because it's impossible to know. Because I know that there were times that I wasn't able to figure out when she was arrested, so I haven't. But I'm sure it was uh, maybe, in the teens or 20s in terms of her arrests.
Yeah. So Sophie had a nemesis in her life, a woman named Teresa Lewis.
Oh, yes, Teresa Lewis, yeah.
Would you share with us how they met and how they developed into such enemies?
Well, Sophie had established herself in Detroit at this point. Was separated from Ned. He was in prison again. And so she has a home in Detroit at 23rd and 4th Street, which is right near where the Ambassador Bridge from Canada comes in right now. There's no neighborhood left there at all. Everything's gone. All the homes are gone. But then it was apparently a fairly nice neighborhood, and she had a home. And this woman, Teresa Lewis, showed up at her door one day. She'd been kicked out of her home where she'd been staying with her sister and brother-in-law, and she asked if she could stay. And at some point, Sophie, when she'd been incarcerated in the Detroit jail a few weeks or months earlier, Teresa, who was a very religious woman, had gone in and had been making visits to the prisoners in jail and offering to read the Bible with them. So Sophie remembered her, and when Teresa showed up, she said, "Okay, sure, yeah, I'll give you a place to stay. I've got an extra room. You come on in." And Teresa began living with Sophie. But Teresa was really kind of a hard luck story because her husband had died and she had a young son to support, and she really had no means, like many women whose husbands died back then. She had no way to support herself, and her parents were dead, and her sister was sick of her. So, this gave her an opportunity. She began to realize that Sophie was involved in these criminal activities, and she began to think, well, this might be a chance for me to make some money. So she went to the Detroit police and she got an interview with the chief of police, Andrew Rogers, and she said, "If you will pay me, I will spy on this woman for you, and I will bring you things that she has stolen, and you can." Before they get fenced, you can, take numbers off watches and just get a general sense of what's going on here. And Rogers apparently said yes to this idea. And Teresa is sometimes referred to in newspaper articles as a woman detective, which in a way she was. But she went through with her end of the bargain and brought a lot of things in. Sophie was often off at this time, out of town, going to various cities to do her pickpocketing and shoplifting. She went to a lot of cities in Ohio. She particularly liked Ohio. It wasn't too far away. So Teresa would take these things, and the police would make notes, and then she would take them back, so nobody knew that they'd been gone. And eventually, Sophie, got into trouble, and through what was going on with Teresa, and eventually she realized that Teresa was spying on her, and she absolutely hated her for it. And it got, she kicked her out. She kicked Teresa out of the house. She accused her of stealing. Sophie accused Teresa of stealing from her. There was a trial related to Teresa stealing things, which, she ended up being acquitted, but that was a difficult period. And Andrew Rogers, the chief of police, lost his job over this whole scandal. So, Sophie absolutely hated Teresa. And at one point during all of these various trials and hearings and stays in the House of Correction and in jail, one of her younger daughters died in Windsor. She was in a boarding school in Windsor, Canada, a Catholic boarding school, and she died. And I think Sophie really, really then hated Teresa, even though she probably couldn't have, she died of scarlet fever, so she wouldn't have been able to prevent the child from dying. But I think she hated the idea that it happened when she was so distracted by all of these things. And she totally blamed Teresa. She also hated the chief of police of Detroit. So
Yeah. Speaking of children, and you do write a lot about her children,
mm-hmm.
but one in particular,
Mm-hmm.
he was a troubled kid from almost the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about George and what happened between him and his mother?
Sure. Well, George was the oldest child, and I believe that when Sophie and Ned began to be estranged and not get along with each other, that George spent time with Ned by himself. And, Ned, as we know, was a career criminal, and he began to teach George his techniques for bank robbery and various things. And so George started to go down this path of being a criminal when he was quite young, apparently when he was in his early teens. And by the time he was in his mid-teens, Ned was gone. Ned was in prison, but George was on his own in New York City, and he developed his own gang of young robbers. And he eventually got caught, and he was sent to Auburn Penitentiary. I'm sorry, originally he was sent to Elmira Penitentiary in Elmira, New York, eventually. And he could have been sent to the House of Refuge, but he lied about how old he was. He claimed that he was older than he was. So they sent him to Elmira, where the minimum age was 17, and he was only 15. And Elmira had an indeterminate sentencing rule. So that meant when you were sent to Elmira, it would depend on the warden. The warden could decide when you would be released. And George hated that. He hated not knowing how long he was going to be able how long he was going to be forced to spend there. And he did not like the warden, who was a man named Zebulon Brockway. And apparently they were doing some pretty nasty things. Conditions were not great. And so George did a lot of complaining. He even complained to some New York governmental body about it when they were looking into Brockway and how things were running at Elmira, because this indeterminate sentencing was a new idea, and nobody was quite sure that it was a good idea. So George did some complaining, and nobody really liked him among the warden and the guards. So he got his wish. When he turned 19, they decided to send him to Auburn prison. And Auburn was the hardcore prison. This was the place where you had, solitary confinement was the rule, and nobody spoke. No, the prisoners didn't speak to each other. And I don't think, probably as 21st century people, we can imagine quite how bad conditions were in these prisons, these 19th century prisons. They were awful. And George ended up getting typhoid fever and dying there shortly before he turned 20, I believe. So, and Sophie had gone to visit him, and he had begged her to get him out somehow, pull strings, do whatever. And she had to tell him that there's nothing I can do. I can't get you out of here. So she said, you'll just have to serve your sentence. And he was close to being released when he died. So yeah, that's a sad part of the story.
Yeah, his complaint was that he wasn't able to perform the hard labor that he was assigned, right?
Right. That's correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's what he said, that at Elmira, he was small, of course, but partly because he wasn't the age that he had said he was. But they were having, prisoners always worked at all these prisons so that they could make money for the prison, so that they didn't have to charge taxpayers to run the prison. So he was apparently forced to carry around heavy ladles of like molten metal of some sort, and he wasn't able to do it, and he was slapping it on his feet. So yes, he complained. That was another thing that he complained about to the New York State authorities.
Wow.
Yeah.
When we return, what happens to Sophie Lyons at the end of her life? My guest shares details of her final years. And we're back. So in 1887, Sophie goes back to Detroit, and she files for divorce from Ned Lyons, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And after that, she falls into company with Big Jim Brady.
In 1888, she connected with Big Jim Brady. He was still in prison in 1887. He was in Auburn. He actually offered to pay for George's funeral. She didn't have enough money. So he knew Ned, and he offered to pay for the funeral. And that is apparently sort of how they got reacquainted with one another. They may have known each other earlier in the early New York City days. So yes, he offered to do that. That was a real kindness for her, to be able to bury George in an actual cemetery. So they got together when Jim got out, and Jim had been in Auburn for 11 years by the time he got out. So they hooked up in England or in Europe, and they started. Jim was a bank robber, but he was also a con man, and he was also great at disguises and things like that. So they started conning people in Europe and convincing them that they were wealthy people, and then robbing them. So they did that for a while. Then they came back to Detroit and did some pickpocketing in Detroit, and then they went back to England and did some more bank jobs over there. And then Sophie had her last child, who was Jim's daughter, Sophia Brady, and then Jim vanished. So, yeah, that's the story of Jim.
I found this part funny. When Brady was being released from prison,
Yes. Yes.
he was asked by someone what his religion was.
He said he was a, what did he say he was?
Materialist.
Materialist. He was a material. I mean, this is, if you look at this record from Auburn, everybody's saying either Roman Catholic or Protestant, mostly Roman Catholic, because a lot of these people were Irish. And Jim was the son of Irish immigrants. And so he was Roman Catholic, but he said he was a materialist. I think he said that on purpose, I think he thought that was funny,
So as Sophie got older, especially after one specific stint in prison where she got sick, you write that her looks kind of began to harden.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
she couldn't rely on sexual blackmail for steady income any longer.
Right. Yeah. She had to do some other things. Yeah. So, she continued doing the con stuff. And she was also hooking up with another guy, Billy Burke, Billy the Kid, William James Burke, who was a younger man. He was 11 years younger, I believe, but they had sort of had an off and on relationship for a while. And but as she got older, she really latched on to Billy and wanted to keep him. And they eventually did get married, but not until 1910. And they were doing a lot of sneak thief stuff. Billy was a really well-known sneak thief. And sneak thieves were bank robbers often, but they were people who would steal money by subterfuge, not trying to break into a vault or, using a gun or something like that. So they would come up with different ways to go into a bank and distract people, maybe when during lunchtime, when there weren't as many workers in the bank, they would find ways to distract people. So of course they had to be con men, because they had to look like they were on the up and up, and like they were, oh yeah, I'm ready to put some money in this bank, and just happen to be here, at the moment. And oh, let me reach over there and grab that money, and let me do it while your back is turned. And so that was what Billy was about. And he was a career criminal. He started as a very young man and continued until he was too old and feeble to do it. But Sophie did a number of bank robberies with him. She was involved. She would often be the person who would distract the clerk. And then as time went on and Billy began to live with her in Detroit, he would claim to be a realtor or a real estate agent. But in the meantime, he's often getting involved, going off and doing a bank robbery here or there. And she was often running to his rescue to try to get him out of jail, or, get him a good attorney to get him off, something like that. So yeah, as she got older, that was kind of, she sort of devoted her life to Billy Burke, even though he didn't seem to devote his life to her. She was totally enamored of him. And he predeceased her, which I think was hard for her. Even though he was younger, he died before she did, and I think that was really the turning point for her, of just having really being quite depressed much of the time.
And I'm sure my listeners have figured it out, but just to be completely clear, this is a different Billy the Kid than the one we are used to.
No, this was not William Bonney. He had died years and years before out west, but or at least people think he did. No, this is a different Billy the Kid, or different Billy Burke was his name, William Burke, but he was called Billy the Kid, and he was around the same age as William Bonney. So it's possible that some of his criminal friends thought that this was a funny thing to call him, to
Yeah.
knowing about Billy the Kid. Oh, here's another Billy the Kid, because he was quite, apparently when he was, he got started early, and he was quite, if you look at his mugshots from early on, he was quite young looking in those early mugshots. So that may be a tie-in also.
So it was the summer of 1889, right? When Sophie and Billy Burke traveled to Europe and brought back a sizable chunk of money, wealth.
Well, they traveled a number of times to Europe and brought back wealth many times when they traveled to Europe. So, yes, I'm sure there was one in 1899. But then during the early 20th century, they were over there quite a bit. It's hard to know exactly how many times they were over there, because again, there weren't great records of this. But they came back, and at this point, the Detroit police again are totally sick of them, really want to get them out of town. So the Detroit police chief told told all the bankers in town who Billy Burke was, and he told his officers that if Billy was seen on the street, he'd be arrested. He didn't matter whether he had pulled a crime or was suspected of something. They were just to arrest him, and of course that was illegal, but he didn't care.
And in the meantime, she was involved in other illegalities, including smuggling Chinese immigrants into America.
Right, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, people couldn't come in from China very easily anymore to America. So yes, she was, and because Detroit is so close to Canada, a quick ferry ride across the Detroit River from, you go from Windsor to Detroit and you're there. And so yes, she got involved in that. She got involved in another scam related to mail order brides. Again, this was kind of a big thing in America at that point. This idea that, a lot of men had gone out west. There weren't a lot of women out there. They were looking for a wife. And these marriage bureaus sprung up around America, and they were usually scams. Send us $5, you get, or whatever, however amount of money they wanted. Send us this money, we'll enroll you in the program, and we'll give you the names of all these women who are just hankering to go out to Wyoming or Northern California or wherever it is you are, and of course it was just a scam for the most part. The men lost their money, so she got involved in that. Yep.
So was there a transition for her from a criminal life to a life of honesty? Did she settle down and take the straight and narrow?
Well, I think she did by the time she wrote her memoir, or by the time her memoir was published in 1913. I think she was done with crime at that point. Although she was still perfectly fine with being married to a criminal and trying to get him out of jail or prison or whatever. This is Billy Burke again. But I think she was finished with crime at that point. Yes. But she claimed to have been done much earlier, and I don't think she was. I think the first decade of the 20th century was the time when she was going to Europe, doing most of her criminal activity in Europe, of going and robbing people, going into nice hotels and convincing people she was a well-off person, and then finding ways to steal their jewels or whatever. But I mean, she and Billy were over there doing that a lot. But I think by 1913, I mean, obviously she's written this book, Why Crime Does Not Pay. So, she really can't be, if the Detroit police pick her up for some reason, it's going to really look bad. And I think she wanted to be part of good society by then. At that point, Detroit has become a huge city. I mean, it's become a place where you've got all these wealthy industrialists, and people, the automobile companies are there, and it's just, she wants to be part of that, but of course she's never going to be, because she also wanted to keep talking about how great crime was and all these fun things she'd done when she was younger, and isn't crime interesting? And of course it is interesting. And, but a lot of the people from the good part of society didn't want to hear about this. So yeah, she never really made it into acceptance, I don't think.
Yeah. So her relationship with her children in general was difficult. We don't need to go over each and every one of them.
Mm-hmm.
People can delve into those by reading your book.
Right.
But the book you talked about finding at the beginning of this interview with her daughter Florence's name inside, I'd love it if you could address Sophie's sometimes stormy relationship with Florence,
Mm-hmm.
and whether they were ever able to make amends.
Sure. Florence was the only child of Sophie's who lived most of her life in Detroit. So Sophie, when Sophie got to Detroit, apparently Florence moved there also. Well, Florence was in boarding school, Catholic boarding school in Windsor. And but when Sophie couldn't pay the bills in the early 1880s, Florence got kicked out of the boarding school. And she did eventually, as sort of mid-teens, she made her way to Detroit, and she lived off and on with Sophie. But she also had some sort of low-wage jobs, working through. She got some jobs through the Catholic Church, working at different institutions, and she was quite a serious Catholic, apparently. Sophie was Jewish, but Ned was a Catholic, and so Florence stayed around in Detroit, but she had to change her name, and she started to, because she didn't want people to associate her with her mother, and she started to do things like she would work as a nanny. She did have a pretty good education, so she was able to work as a nanny and teach languages to her charges. But if someone found out that she was Sophie's daughter, they'd fire her right away. So it was kind of a tough road to hoe. But she ended up staying there, working low-wage jobs, and she did get married, but unfortunately her husband was an alcoholic. And then in the early 20th century, she had her only child, Esther, and was off with the husband again, so really had no way it was very difficult for her to make money. And she began to work as an organ grinder on the streets of Detroit, sort of just a beggar almost. And Sophie saw her one day, and she apparently was very abusive towards Florence and said, "I'm not giving you any money, why are you wasting your life this way? Why did you marry this horrible man? I didn't approve of him, and why are you wasting your life? You could be doing something better than this." And so they really didn't get along, and they had this sort of public feud for a little while. And then Florence kind of goes into the shadows, and apparently she was just sort of living off charity. And, if somebody had a barn she could stay in, that was okay. And so it was rough for her. And but finally, as Sophie got to be older, and especially after Billy Burke died, Sophie was concerned about her daughter Madeline, or Sophia Brady, whose alias was Madeline Belmont. And so Sophie reconnected with Florence because she wanted Florence to go over to England, where Madeline was, and find out what was going on with her. She apparently been put into a mental institution because she was suffering from a mental illness. So Sophie reconnected with Florence finally and made amends with Florence and said, "Please come back and live with me. I need help. I'm really in dire straits. I don't have anybody. I need you." And it looks like Florence was about ready to do that when Sophie died.
Wow. So when did Sophie die, and what happened to her estate after her death?
Sophie died in the spring of 1924, and after she died, there was a big battle over her estate. The the probate got closed too quickly, in Florence's opinion, and Florence wanted it reopened. And because she heard that Madeline, the half sister in England, was only going to get $2,000, and she didn't think that was fair. She thought Madeline was seriously ill at that point, and she thought Madeline needed more. So there was a big fight over reopening the probate, and it went all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court. And Sophie had very good lawyers. She always had very good lawyers. In fact, the executor of her estate was a man named Ira Jane, who was a judge at that point, and well-known man in Detroit. So this fight went to the Supreme Court, and actually they sided with Florence, and they did reopen the estate, and they did change how things were going to be divided up so that Madeline got some additional money from the estate. And that was what happened. That was, I think, ended up being a good thing, but in the long run, it's not clear that Madeline really saw much of that money.
What was her estate worth at her passing?
Sophie was worth almost $250,000, and she'd been bragging in earlier in her life that she was worth at least $1 million. So when she died, a lot of people, particularly in Detroit, were like, "Well, how much is she worth? Is she really worth $1 million?" And it turned out to be not $1 million, but $250,000 back then was about $3.5 million in today's money. And, given that most of these criminals that she came up with ended up absolutely penniless with absolutely no money at all, it's kind of amazing that she ended up with that amount of money. But she was very miserly about her money. There's no doubt about that. She watched it like a hawk. So she ended up with a pretty good amount, and she wanted most of it to go to build this charity home for the children of criminals. And that was what her will stated, was it should go to build this charity home, or, she wanted them to use some buildings that she already owned and just convert these into a charity home. She wanted as many as 500 people to be able to live in this home, which is a huge amount. And many people said that it was people who knew Sophie and worked on her buildings said, "No, these buildings are terrible. You're going to have to just tear them down and build something else." So it seemed to be kind of an unworkable idea, but the executors were fine with closing the estate until Florence started to make a lot of noise. And they, the Supreme Court said, "No, reopen it. Let's look at this again." And they did reallocate some of the money. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
So tell us about your website and how people can get your book.
Well, my website is capturedandexposed.com, and it combines my interest in 19th century, primarily 19th century and early 20th century mugshot photography with genealogy and telling stories about people's lives, primarily criminals' lives. And so, yeah, that's the website. And there's a link to where to getting the book on Amazon there. You can also buy it from McFarland, the publisher. And yeah, that's the story of that.
Perfect. Well, this has been really, really fun. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, I'm very happy to have joined you. It's been really fun for me too.
Again, I have been speaking to Shayne Davidson. She is the author of Queen of the Burglars, The Scandalous Life of Sophie Lyons. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.